Well, nice to see all of you. Good evening. And welcome to our last lecture of the semester, but not the least. And I'm very excited about this lecture. This is the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and tonight in association with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I am very happy, actually unexpectedly. We have with us somebody that I picked up a book last semester. I was on sabbatical, and we have some free time when we're on sabbatical. We just read things that we don't necessarily have to. And I picked up this book that caught my attention. It was very nicely written piece of work. I looked up the author a little bit more and checked out his work, and it was Professor Zachariah of Mampilly. And I reached out to him, and I said it would be great to have you with us in Boston next semester and to tell us about your work. And little did I know that, here we are this fall semester, if we can measure time with a semester schedule. And it seems like everybody is out in the streets in the entire planet. And over the summer, Algeria was out in the street, and still is in the street, but it was more prominently in the news, and South Sudan, and people in Tunisia just went to the ballot box, and Algerians are going to go to the ballot box, and there are all kinds of events taking place in Lebanon and Iraq, and if you look on this side of the planet, Colombia now, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Port-au-Prince, Haiti. It seems like we are in this moment of popular protest. So on top of having the ability of bringing this great professor to Boston, or having him with us, we're very fortunate that he's here on a conference, and being very opportunistic as an institute, we said, why don't you also give us a lecture. So I'm going to introduce Professor Zachariah Mampilly. He's a professor of political science and international studies. He's currently the Marx Chair of International Affairs at the School of Public and International Affairs at the City University of New York. In 2012-2013, he was Fulbright visiting professor at the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He's the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, which was a publication of 2011. And he's also the author of, or the co-author of Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change, which was published in 2015. And we had the pleasure to read it in Street Democracy this semester. The co-author is Adam Grant. Professor Mampilly teaches courses on civil wars, rebel movements, race, ethnicity, and nationalism, and international relations of the Third World. Warm welcome for Dr. Mampilly.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on November night. I know it's a busy time of the semester, so I'm really glad to see so many folks. Thank you, Petros, for organizing and inviting me to be with all of you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that Petros mentioned, Africa Uprising, which is now a few years old, but also try to update the story from there, because I think, as Petros already mentioned, the question of popular protest has not diminished in any sense since 2015. If anything, it continues to be quite active, not only in Africa, but in many other parts of the world. And I think the African stories are often sort of erased from this broader narrative of global uprisings. It's a part of what we want to do here in this book, and I think in my talk today, is talk about how Africa figures into this broader global wave of protest that you all are living through currently, and try to offer some insights from the African perspective, about what is driving all of these protests and where they might be leading to. Okay? So let me just jump right into this. So a few of the questions, I think one of the important ones, as I will show you today, Africa has been at the forefront of this global wave of protest, but has largely remained somewhat absent from the broader conversations of what's happening. It's quite common to see in the media, social media, lists of countries that are going through protests currently, and African countries are conspicuously left off the list, despite the fact that as recently as a few months ago, Sudan overthrew its long-standing dictatorship after 30 years through a popular revolution. Similar things are unfolding in many parts of Africa, as I will discuss today. And it still remains somewhat outside of this broader conversation on African protest. I think here I can just mention the origin of this book actually was when I was a visiting professor at the University of Dar es Salaam, and my co-author, Adam Branch, was teaching at Mampilly University in Uganda. This was 2012, 2013, and so we were living in African countries teaching in these different universities, and all around us were these huge popular uprisings going on, and as somebody based in the United States, I was reading the Western media, and there was a trope in the media that kept on asking this question of when will the Arab Spring spread south, right? And it was really striking to us that you could see these huge protests unfolding in Kampala and other places around East Africa, and it was almost as if nobody was paying attention. Right? So that was what really spurred us to want to understand not only the dynamics of these protests, but also some bigger sort of meta questions about why Africa is often left out of these conversations around global protests. As I'll discuss today, we try to historicize the question of African protests, and so we are currently living through what we refer to as the third wave of African protests. So we'll talk a lot about what this third wave protest is and what is driving it. Very importantly, I think one of the concerns that we had as academics, especially based in the West, is this tendency that is very common to sort of project onto African protests a kind of Western model of civil society and popular protests. Right? And what we wanted to do is say, yes, there are commonalities between how protests emerge in different parts of the world, but there are distinctive aspects to protest as well. And so instead of starting with sort of a Western model of popular protest and applying it to the African cases, what we wanted to do is to look at African history and try to discern what is distinctive about African protests. And importantly, what can be learned by studying these histories of African protests. And so that's where I really want to start today, by sort of talking about kind of a longer scope of African protests, right? And to show, hopefully, how that is influencing the current wave of African protests that we are experiencing right now. And then ideally we'll have some time to talk about things that we can learn from the African experiences. In many ways, what I would suggest is that the African uprisings have been far more effective than uprisings in other parts of the world. Right? I think it's important for us to try to ask the question of why. Just to give you a sense of how we approach the study of the book, and what I've been doing since the book came out. As I just mentioned, I'll start with sort of the historical analysis of some of the key debates that defined earlier protest waves in Africa. In the book, we sort of look inside of 4 different protest movements that were unfolding in the early 2010s, specifically Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Nigeria. And I'll say a little bit about each of these. But Africa's a big place. There are 55 countries on the continent. They make a lot of big generalizations about Africa. But we also want to recognize the sheer diversity of African countries. And so we also looked at how these protest dynamics are unfolding in different parts of Africa through more quantitative assessment. And I'll share a little bit of data from the book here as well. Since the book came out, I've been engaged with a number of different African social movements that are really trying to think through what happens after the revolution. Right? So Senegal, for example, in 2012, a movement called Yenamar was able to prevent the president in that country from running for a 3rd term. And then they have not disbanded, so they've remained active since 2012, but are really trying to figure out what happens once you have successfully overthrown a head of state, but you don't necessarily get the outcome that you may have aspired to. Right? You may have gotten a new head of state in, but that head of state oftentimes may look very similar to the head of state that he or she just displaced. And so Myanmar, rather than simply disbanding, has really been trying to think through this question of what happens to social movements after the revolutionary moment. And I think many different African countries, now that we're almost a decade into the 3rd wave of African protest, are confronting a similar question. Right? So I've been doing some work with a network of African social movements that is called Afriki, and if we have time, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But let me go back and try to provide some of the historical context, because I think it's really important to understand from where African social movements emerge, what is their sort of particular lineage, and I think it can be helpful for understanding the question I posed at the outset about why it is that African social movements are often left out of conversations globally around protest. If we look back, and I think for most of you know anything about Africa, you probably are familiar with this period of the 1940s to the 1960s. This is the period in which all of Africa is under European colonial rule. And by the 1940s, you have pretty evolved social movements that have emerged in many parts of Africa that are challenging colonial domination, roughly inspired by the Indian National Congress. And I think the figure who is sort of most closely associated with this is a man named Kwame Nkrumah, who was the leader of the anti-colonial movement in what is now known as Ghana. At the time, it was referred to as the Gold Coast. Nkrumah is a really interesting figure. He borrowed very heavily from the model of the Indian National Congress, the movement, the nonviolent movement for Indian independence, which had brought independence to South Asia in the late 1940s. And so he really embraced the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And as the leader of this broad coalition of different social forces in what's called the Gold Coast, he created a political party that became the forefront of the anti-colonial resistance. And the core of Nkrumah's message was the idea that Africans should abandon the violent struggles that had defined earlier periods, because most of those ended up very poorly for African resistance movements. You talk about the Mai Mai rebellion in places like Tanzania, the Mau Mau in Kenya. In all these cases, you have anti-colonial violent struggles that are very brutally repressed and crushed by the colonial empire. And so Nkrumah is advocating for a shift away from violent struggle towards the non-violent strategy of a political party that can bring together all of these different social forces into a disciplined, non-violent movement through which you can push back against colonial domination. This strategy worked really well in the case of what becomes known as Ghana. And so by 1957, Ghana becomes the first country in what's called sub-Saharan Africa to gain its independence. And so Nkrumah kind of emerges almost as a prophet of decolonization. He immediately tries to use his new position as president of Ghana to influence other social movements, other struggles for independence across the African continent. Nkrumah, of course, was a prominent Pan-Africanist, and so he wanted to use his position as the leader of an independent country in Africa to help other African countries gain their independence. And so he starts hosting a variety of different conferences, right, and tries to promote this gospel, as it were, of nonviolent struggle as the route through which African countries can gain their independence. But despite his successes, there was pushback to his nonviolent strategy, and perhaps most prominently was a Martinican figure named Frantz Fanon, who had moved to Algeria in the 1950s and become a part of something called the National Liberation Front. And Frantz Fanon, in contrast to Nkrumah, basically suggested that nonviolent struggle is great when it works, when the situation allows it, but in certain situations, such as those prevailing in Algeria at the time, that it was a fool's errand to commit to a struggle, to a strategy of nonviolent resistance, when you know that the response from the French colonial authority was always going to be repressive. Right? He actually has a quote, and I'll paraphrase it. It says, "We've tried this strategy of nonviolent resistance, but when we went into the streets 35 times, and the French slaughtered us 35 times, we abandoned." Right? And so he starts to advocate for violent resistance as an alternative to the nonviolent strategies that Nkrumah is putting forth during this period. These are actually very robust debates that are occurring. They actually met a number of times, and they were at similar conferences that Nkrumah organized, including something called the All Africa People's Conference in 1958, where they actually are debating these two strategies. And I think I want to emphasize this debate because it's one that remains very pertinent into the contemporary moment. If you're paying attention, for example, to the Hong Kong protests, this is a debate that is very much going on there in terms of what kinds of strategy are going to be effective against an authoritarian regime like the Chinese, right, where we know the Chinese are not averse to using military force to crush nonviolent movements, as they did in 1989 and continue to do ever since. And I think that the key sort of takeaway here is that nonviolent strategies can be effective, but they are contingent. Right? It is not something that you should embrace simply for a moralistic perspective, as Nkrumah and Gandhi put it forward, but rather based on the conditions that you are confronted. Right? In certain conditions, nonviolent struggles can be very effective. In others, perhaps, as Fanon suggests, they are unlikely to do so, and you may need to consider other strategies. This is an ongoing debate in many parts of Africa, and I'll come back to this when we talk about the third wave. If you look at the impact of the anti-colonial wave of protests in Africa, you can see that they're remarkably effective. Right? So, in 1956, most of Africa is still under colonial rule. By 1963, most of Africa has shed colonial rule, except for parts of southern Africa, which remain under British, French, French and Portuguese rule in particular. Right? So, it is a situation in which these nonviolent uprisings are able to bring about tremendous political change. Right? They actually lead to the independence of most African countries within a fairly short period of time. But what comes after? And here, I think the story is less appealing, even in places like Ghana, which has been led by Nkrumah. You see kind of the rise of militarized nationalism and one-party rule. Right? So rather than sort of trying to create a democratic arrangement in Ghana, Nkrumah himself becomes more authoritarian. He cracks down on opposition movements. And he himself is eventually overthrown by the military in a coup d'etat, which then leads to many decades of authoritarian rule in the Ghanaian context. This is a story that is replicated pretty much throughout African countries. So they start off with these very inspirational anti-colonial movements that bring together large numbers of people into this common agenda of overthrowing colonial rule. But once independence is achieved, they sort of descend down this common path. And if you look at this quantitatively, basically from the end of colonial rule in the early 1960s through the 1990s, only 3 of Africa's 55 countries are even remotely democratic. Right? Instead, most of the continent during this period remains under one-party or authoritarian rule of some form. Just to give you a sense of Kwame Nkrumah's ability to mobilize the populations, this is Nkrumah at a rally in the lead up to independence in that country. One thing I'll just point here is that a lot of his support is drawn from young people, right, and young men in particular. In Ghana at the time, on the Gold Coast at the time, many young people had moved into these urban areas but were not able to find work in the colonial economy. And hence they were referred to as the veranda boys. Right? They would lounge around on the verandas, and they were viewed as a threat to public order. And actually in the 1940s, there were a series of riots in Ghana that were called the veranda boy riots. And Nkrumah was very sophisticated in sort of wielding this threat of violence amongst the poor as a means to get the British to make concessions to the nonviolent struggle. So essentially what Nkrumah was able to do and what made him so successful is to say either you negotiate with me or you will deal with them. And wielding that threat of violence, as Gandhi had done in India too, was a particularly effective strategy for gaining concessions from the British, because they too were very afraid of these undifferentiated populations causing disorder within the colony. Okay, so let me jump ahead here to the second wave of African protests. These are a series of protests that began in 1985 in Sudan that are organized around the so-called structural adjustment programs. If you're not familiar with the African history during this period, or the history of developing countries more generally, the 1970s and 1980s was a period in which the international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank start to impose on many countries in the developing world a very severe set of economic conditionalities, a set of austerity programs that demand that African countries slash social welfare programs and maintain various forms of budgetary discipline if they want to access aid from the international financial institutions. This led to a lot of resentment amongst the populations, so things like primary education, healthcare were slashed during these periods in the name of budgetary discipline. And so you start to see by 1985 in Sudan a series of uprisings around daily life conditions, right? Triggered by, say, an increase in the cost of bread or fuel or other basic commodities. And a lot of this anger is directed against the sort of authoritarian regimes that are in power at this time. And so by 1985, you see protests spreading from Sudan to other parts of Africa. so that by 1990 you have popular uprisings unfolding in 14 African countries, right? Mostly in Central and West Africa. And these were really interesting. They actually lead to a profound crisis. If you know your history, you know this is also the period at the end of the Cold War. So a lot of these authoritarian regimes that have been able to survive were heavily reliant on funding that they're receiving either from the Soviet Union or the United States. Now all of a sudden they're in the midst of these huge debt crises, and they no longer have the ability to gain resources from either the First or Second World, the Soviets or the Americans. And so it's a very unstable moment in African history, and it produces a surge of popular uprisings across the continent. And in the face of this popular pressure, many of these kind of sclerotic regimes that are no longer able to rely on external patrons are forced to make concessions to the protesters. And so they start what are referred to as the sovereign national conferences. Right? Essentially, they agree to negotiations with the opposition movements. They bring together representatives from all these different social forces in their countries, representatives of the peasants, representatives from women's groups, from youth, from labor, from students, from the media, and they gather in a room to try to negotiate a way out of the impasse. And what happens in some of these countries is that the members of these conferences actually say, you know what, we're going to declare the conference itself sovereign. We're going to take power from the government. And instead of, we never had a constitutional convention as we had in the United States. And so we are going to now do that in our own countries. Right? This was a very promising moment that could have led to a lot of interesting changes in many African countries. But then they start to come under pressure from international donors, they come under pressure from these regimes that are trying to hold on to power. And so instead of a broad sort of transformative moment, what you get is a very sort of vapid form of multi-partyism. The opposition parties in particular are able to use this broad outrage amongst the population and say that what the people really want is elections. And that's what you get. And so by 2007, you see this process of democratization, a very specific form of democratization that reduces democracy simply to the question of elections, spreading across Africa. So that by 2007, 20 of Africa's 55 countries are classified as democracies according to sort of the standard measures of democratization, like Freedom House. An additional 20, so a total of 40 African countries are regularly holding elections. So even countries that are considered to be more authoritarian start to embrace the electoral model of politics, and they hold regular elections, which suggests that they are on the road to democratization, even as they are manipulating those elections in very particular ways. And then you kind of hit a plateau, right? So by 2007, this process of democratization comes to a halt, and based again on some of these metrics, you see that even those countries that were willing to hold elections are starting to manipulate constitutions again. You may have heard this term, third termism. This sort of speaks to kind of the afterlife of this process of reform, so that some of these regimes came to power around this period, and then are constitutionally barred from running more than 2 terms. And so what they do, rather than sort of accepting the constitutional rules and stepping down, they try to rewrite the constitutions, right, in order to allow themselves to stay in power beyond their constitutionally sanctioned amount. And that leads us, well, first, just to give you an image from this period, and, some of the protests that were unfolding across Africa during this time. But that leads us to the current moment. Right? And in the book, we suggest that this ongoing wave of protests in Africa really begins in 2005 in Ethiopia, where you had a mass popular uprising where something like 50,000 people came out into the streets in one of the most authoritarian countries in the world. Ethiopia has liberalized its political sphere a little bit in the past year. Some of you probably know that the Ethiopian president was recently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for some of his efforts to open up the political space. But the protests in Ethiopia actually began back in 2005. And when they first emerged during this period, the response from the regime, which was a military government, was to crack down on the protesters very brutally. So it has kind of this really extraordinary moment where people in the most difficult circumstances possible take to the streets in huge numbers, but are completely repressed. Right? And so from 2005 really to about 2010, you see these sort of sporadic events breaking out in different parts of Africa, but the response is largely the same. If we look at the sort of time period between 2005 and 2015, which is the period in which we collected data for the book, you see by 2010 that these protests started to spread to many different regions of Africa, so that something like 40 different African countries have had popular uprisings in every region of the continent. Most of these are triggered by often rather mundane events. It could be an incumbent's efforts to kind of manipulate elections, or a spike in the price of bread. And so what starts off as a very specific kind of single issue protest will then morph into a much larger critique of the entire political and economic system and calls for the fall of the government itself. This is a pretty robust pattern, and it's not unusual, though commentators often struggle with it, right? So in Sudan, for example, months into these protests where people were calling for the overthrow of the entire regime, commentators were still referring to them as bread protests, because what had triggered the protests themselves was an increase in the cost of bread. But the important lesson here is that protests are contingent events. Right? When they start as a very discrete demand around a very specific issue, like a reduction in the cost of bread, can morph into a much bigger call for the overthrow of a government itself, right, based on the response of the government to the initial protests. This is what we mean, we say as social scientists, that they are contingent processes. So whatever the trigger is, it almost becomes irrelevant. Instead, it's how the government responds to that initial trigger that then sets off this interactive process. For example, protesters go out on the streets calling for a reduction in the cost of bread, and the government opens fire on the protesters. And that triggers a much bigger response where now protesting not the cost of bread, but the government's overreaction to the initial outrage of protest. And so you see this pattern unfolding in many parts of Africa. What starts off as often very discrete protests around very specific issues tend to morph very quickly into calls for the overthrow of the regime itself. And again, to come back to the question of why don't we pay attention, there is a clear tendency in many of these protests that they don't articulate clear agendas from the onset. If the protests start off demanding, and this is perhaps the failure of Western models, which assume that a protest that starts off over the cost of bread can only be judged successful if the cost of bread goes down. Right? But as I just mentioned, these protests quickly morph into much bigger critiques of the overall government, and so they get dismissed as failing to articulate a clear set of demands. Right? Many of these protests also lack clear leadership structures. They are decentralized protests. Part of this is intentional. They are learning from the experiences of other protest movements where leaders are targeted. Hence, our governments are able to stop the protest by arresting key figures, and so in response to that, they've taken on a very decentralized approach. What this often means is that it's very difficult to find sort of a coherent spokesperson on behalf of the movement who can say, I speak for the movement, and what we want is X, Y, and Z. Right? And I think that confusion is a big part of the reason that we don't often pay attention to African protests in particular. A secondary reason, which I sort of hinted at the beginning, is that these protests may often have a violent component to them. Right? Some of these protests are unfolding in some of the more violent parts of Africa, so places like Sudan, which had struggled with civil wars really since the 1950s, places like Congo, which have been active war zones since the 1990s. It's not that these militia movements simply disappear in the face of rising protests. They remain a component of the broader political scenario in which these protest movements must navigate. And so I'll talk about that in the context of the Nigerian protests, which have to deal with the question of Boko Haram. Right? How do you address the reality that many of the same young people who may be drawn into the protest movement may also find the violent option to be attractive. Right? That's something that I think a lot of these movements are struggling with, and one that we can discuss a bit more. Ultimately, I think that there are a set of assumptions around African politics that continue to lead to our dismissal of African protest as perhaps the central driver of political change on the continent today. Right? We tend to view Africa as a predominantly rural space. We tend to think of it as a very poor space. We think that Africans are motivated primarily by their ethnic or tribal identities. And all of this, I think, leads to a dismissal of the power of popular protests and popular movements as being, in fact, I would suggest, the central driver of African politics in the contemporary moment. We can talk more about that if you're interested. Okay, just to give you a sense of some of the data that we collected, we didn't actually rely on existing data sets because they're not very disaggregated. Our interest was specifically in popular protests. So if you look at some of the more well-known data sources like ACLED, some of you may be familiar with, they don't distinguish between different forms of protest. So it could be a protest organized by, say, students over fees, or it could be a popular protest that is calling for their government, and those would be coded as equal in the data set. What we were interested in is these popular protests. Right? So we went and collected data from 2005 to 2014 on where you saw popular uprisings, protests that broke across ethnic lines, that broke across class lines, that broke across the urban-rural divide, and made bigger demands rather than narrow, specific demands for a particular group. So that's what I mean when I say popular protests. I think this is actually a more useful kind of chart just to show you the number of countries that have had protests since 2005. The book actually stops in mid-2014, so that figure was actually 14 protests for 2014. But I think that the key thing, and I've been collecting some of the data since then, and you can see that this continues to ebb and flow, but as we return back to the figures from the late 2000s. I would just point out 2011 in particular, because of course this is the year of the so-called Arab Spring. Most of the attention globally was focused on the 4 North African countries that experienced popular uprisings during this period. If you look at it in a broader African context, you can actually situate the Arab Spring within this third wave of African protests. Okay? It wasn't simply the 4 North African countries that had Arab protests, but in fact, 26 African countries, almost half of Africa's 55 countries, experienced popular uprisings in 2011 alone. And my sense is, 2019 is very high on this metric as well, so I haven't collected the data as yet. Okay, let me talk a little bit about what I think is driving these protests. There's a lot going on here. One of the things I think is really important is that, from the 80s and 90s, these were referred to as Africa's lost decades. This was a period in which most African countries did not grow very much. This is really starting to change around 1995, largely in sync with the rise of China. So you've seen ever since 1995 that 80% of countries have had growth rates are greater than 3%. Almost all of this has been fueled by the rise of China. China has surpassed both the EU and the United States as Africa's largest trading partner. This is pretty extraordinary if you take a longer view of the history. In places like Francophone Africa, the currency is still tied to the French franc. The French multinational corporations dominate these economies absolutely. And so the rise of China was extraordinary and extraordinarily rapid too. And now not only China, but a number of other Asian countries have become more prominent trading partners to African countries than the former colonial powers or the US, which was previously the largest trading partner with Africa. What is interesting about the rise of Asian trade in the African context is that it has produced a set of economic dynamics that are contra what economic theory might suggest would happen. So if you look at sort of mainstream economics and what it suggests about how to develop a country, how to produce growth in a country, the assumption is that if you can bring in foreign direct investment, that this will trigger a process of industrialization, and that you can create more industry in a country. You can create more industrial jobs that will lead to the development of a middle class. So the holy grail, as it were, for the international financial institutions is always how do you draw foreign direct investment into developing countries with the goal of helping people enter into a middle class. This was essentially the policy favored by African governments at the behest of the international financial institutions through the 1980s, and it has been completely reversed ever since as a result of Asian investment. Because almost all of the investment coming from places like China has been focused on primarily commodities. So rather than promoting a process of industrialization, really interestingly, Africa is actually less industrial today than it was during the 1980s. Right? And what economists refer to this is deindustrialization. This is important because what it means is even though you have a lot of foreign direct investment and a lot of wealth coming into African countries, there has not been a kind of shared prosperity. Right? It's not leading to ordinary Africans being able to find good work in the urban areas that can help pull them out of poverty, but instead has led to very high levels of growth, with almost all of that growth being captured by a very narrow elite of Africans. Right? So even the World Bank now acknowledges that despite these tremendous growth rates that some African countries have experienced, there has been no overall decline in poverty in Africa in the aggregate sense. So there's as many poor people in Africa today as there was, say, 20 years ago before this extended period of growth began. Right? The other thing I didn't have up here is that inequality is high. A small number of Africans is capturing all the gains of this economic growth. It means that the amount of inequality on the continent has increased tremendously. If you look at the data, 7 of the most unequal countries in the world, 7 to 10 most unequal countries in the world are in Africa. And this is ripe to produce the conditions where you have a large urban underclass, mostly young, who are economically marginalized. And not only are they economically marginalized, they're living alongside oftentimes tremendous wealth. Right? So if you've been to African cities like Lagos, Cape Town, Dakar, increasingly you see the rise of these almost like gated communities, right? Where the wealthy have now started to wall themselves off from the urban masses who are largely left out of this prosperity that is coming. If you look at the political factors, you see roughly a similar story. Most of the growth in the human population is expected to occur in Africa over the next couple of decades. What this means is that Africa is an extraordinarily young continent. It's referred to by demographers as the youth bulge. Almost 40% of the population in African countries is under the age of 15. This trend is likely to continue. It also is the continent with the largest age gap between the population and its rulers. Right? In many African countries, you have septuagenarians. In some countries, you have nonagenarians, 90-year-olds ruling the countries. 90-year-olds ruling over populations where the average age is 15. I think that's like a 75-year gap. Literally rulers who were alive during colonial times, ruling over populations born in the 21st century. So there's a very vast gap between the rulers and the ruled. And this is, again, conditions that are really ripe for protest. Urbanization, as I mentioned, our predominant assumption about Africa tends to focus on the rural populations. We tend to imagine Africa as a rural space, but Africa is urbanizing at a tremendous pace. Currently, about 40% of the African populations live in urban areas. This trend is only going to continue. Just to give you a sense of what that means, 40% is about the same rate of urban-rural split as India. So Africa is now roughly comparable to India in terms of the share of its population that lives in urban areas. You have the growth of these mega cities. Some of the biggest cities in the world are projected to be in Africa in the next 2 decades. Places like Nigeria, Lagos, Kinshasa, and Congo have already surpassed the 10 million figure, moving very rapidly towards 20 million people, living in these conditions of extreme economic inequality, extreme inequality between age groups. I think as you sort of already mentioned, despite the fact that you have this process of democratization, there's a lot of cynicism around the nature of democracy in African countries. So ruling parties, ruling elites have learned how to hold elections without actually threatening to hold them in power. If you pay any attention, for example, to the recent elections in Congo, it's a very cynical process where the existing president finally agrees to step down from power. But first, he excludes a set of opposition figures from being eligible to run for office. Then when the election is actually held, he basically tells the person who won 60% of the vote that you didn't win the vote, right? And then appoints the person who came second, who got about 19% of the vote, as the president. The U.S. government initially was going to condemn this, but eventually decided not to, and basically said congratulations to the winner, who only won 19% of the vote. This is something that in the 1990s, a Malawian economist named Tandika Nkandawire referred to as choiceless democracy. Right? And I think that is the condition that continues to prevail, which does not mean that Africans are anti-democracy. If you look at something like the Afrobarometer survey, which is perhaps the best survey of African public opinion that we have, you see consistently that something like 80% of Africans prefer democratic rule. They just don't like the kind of diminished form of electoral democracy that currently prevails. And I think, again, if you want to sum this up, you have this increase in democratic institutions, even governments that are highly authoritarian, like Uganda, where ERA Museveni has been in power since 1986, will hold regular elections, but has no actual intention of actually seating power. Right? So you have the increase in democratic institutions, but little substantive change. And again, it creates conditions that are very ripe for popular movements. Okay. So, just a few dilemmas of popular organizing. There's a few that we sort of discuss in the book, that I think I'll just kind of briefly touch upon here. Africa has a civil society, right? But the civil society that exists in many parts of Africa is largely created by Western donations. I don't know if you guys have spent time in African countries, but you'll have no shortage of NGOs, non-governmental organizations that exist and seem to represent a whole variety of different issues. The problem is that a lot of these NGOs don't have much of a base amongst ordinary people, right? They tend to speak English or French. They tend to cite things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They tend to receive their funding from places like the Ford Foundation or the Gates Foundation. And as such, they're not particularly organic amongst the majority of ordinary Africans. Right? Their priorities are determined by foreign funders, the types of issues that they champion, such as the building of toilets, are the things that are popular amongst Western donors, often don't have a lot of resonance for the base material and political conditions that ordinary Africans are concerned about. And so we draw on a theorist named Partha Chatterjee who draws a distinction between what he calls civil society, referring to this formalized sector of NGOs, and what he calls political society, right, which are kind of the unorganized masses, which Frantz Fanon also talks about that. Who are not adequately represented within the formal institutions of civil society, but actually constitute the majority of the urban underclasses. And they are the populations, as we show in the book, that are often at the forefront of these protests. If you go to African cities, you can't help but see these vast slums or shanty towns that have emerged all around these spaces. If you visit them, they are often kind of cut off from any sort of social services. There's very little educational opportunities, no healthcare, and obviously these are the kind of conditions that are fertile for the populations that are at the forefront of many of these protests. And so, there's this dilemma of how do you do an analysis of populations that have no representation. Right? That was a big challenge for us as we tried to write about the protests. Right? It was very easy to talk to kind of very eloquent middle-class Africans who worked for non-governmental organizations, but they often seem to be as disconnected from the protesters as we were as foreign researchers. Right? And so we really wanted to try to visit sites that were actually at the center of many of these protests. And I'll talk about that in specific cases in a minute. The other big kind of dilemma is the urban versus rural gap. As I mentioned, despite the fact that African cities are growing very rapidly, Africa remains a 60% rural place. And it's very hard for some of these urban-centric movements to bring in the rural populations into the protest movement themselves. This is also reflective of the way in which African societies have been compartmentalized. I won't go into the details here, but essentially after colonial rule ended, many African countries retained the form of traditional authority that had been bequested to them by the colonial states. Right? So what this means is that if you live in the rural areas, your access to basic things like land is determined by your membership in an ethnic community. Right? In other words, it creates the conditions for various forms of patronage politics. The urban spaces are different. Ethnicity is not the primary determinant of political life. And as such, they are sites in which popular protest actually emerges. It's much harder to mobilize the rural populations, though, as I'll discuss, some cases have been able to do that. And finally, one that I've already discussed, the reality is that the armed movements that have existed in many of these places do not simply disappear in the face of popular protest. There is instead a negotiation between the protest movement and violent groups. who may share a common goal of overthrowing the state, but differ very dramatically in terms of what they're trying to replace the government with. Okay, pictures. These are images from some of the recent protests that we've seen in Africa over the past decade. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Occupy movement in the United States that was in 2011. This was a very small movement based in New York City. It drew a few thousand people into a place called Zachariah Park over a few months in 2012. But it actually spurred a variety of Occupy protests globally. One of the largest, actually the largest set of Occupy protests took place in Nigeria. It was called Occupy Nigeria. So while the Occupy Wall Street protests would regularly bring, say, thousands or maybe up to 10,000 people to Zachariah Park, the Occupy Nigeria protests brought out about 5 million people into the streets of Lagos and Abuja and other Nigerian cities. Nigeria's a big country, so like 200 million people live there, and they have a long history of protests. And so you see, these are all images from the Occupy protests. It flared very large for about 2 weeks, and then collapsed fairly spectacularly. Mainly because the specter of violence was raised. And so, apocryphally, some of the protest leaders said that Boko Haram had reached out to the organizers of the protest and assured them that there would be no attacks of the protest by Boko Haram. You can imagine, for a group like Boko Haram, the opportunity to launch an attack against the protest would have been ideal in some ways, but there were no attacks by Boko Haram. That being said, the Nigerian government used the specter of Boko Haram attacks to send the military out into the streets, and as a result of the military entering the streets, the protests collapsed after about 2.5 weeks. They were able to gain some concessions. Originally, this protest broke out around fuel subsidies, so you can see the sign there, fuel subsidies. Nigeria's got a very peculiar economy in the sense that it is an oil producer. It relies almost solely on oil production for the majority of its economic value. But because of mismanagement by the state, which controls the oil industry, it has no refining capacity. What that means is that Nigeria produces all this oil, and all of it is exported abroad. And so in order for the Nigerian state to sell the oil back to its population, it has to purchase oil on international markets and then subsidize it to make it affordable for Nigerians. And so what they tried to do is to remove this fuel subsidy. This led to a series of protests that morphed into this much larger demand for the fall of the government. It went on for about 2.5 weeks, created a major crisis, and then it collapsed in the face of military repression. Ethiopia, as I mentioned already, had protests going back to 2005. But more recently, a few years ago, there was a series of protests that broke out that were called the Oromo protests. The Oromo are one of the largest ethnic communities in Ethiopia, who have been historically marginalized by the Ethiopian government, and so they began to demand their political rights a few years ago. And the government, as could be expected, initially cracked down on these protests, and that had the impact. You can see the scale of these protests, pretty extraordinary. This was the symbol of the protesters, but I think this slide is really revealing. So how the government justified its crackdown on the protesters was essentially to say that these were ethnic protests. They were not about the military dictatorship in Ethiopia, but rather a kind of selfish attempt by the Oromo to gain a greater share of resources for their specific community. As a result of that, and as a result of the crackdown on the Oromos, you started to see solidarity protests with the Oromo emerging in many other parts of Ethiopia as well. So you can see this is data from ACLED of where protests were occurring during this period. And the thing you'll notice is that, obviously the bulk of them are centered in Oromia, but they quickly spread to other parts of the country as well. So what started off with specific protests around the subjugation of the Oromo population quickly took on a national character. Right? And these are very important protests because much of the reforms that have unfolded in Ethiopia over the past couple of years, the emergence of President Abiy, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, as I mentioned, were in response to these protests. It's a long-standing ruler, Meles Zenawi. He died a few years ago. He was a very autocratic, brutal figure who cracked down on these protests over and over. He dies kind of suddenly. Right? He's replaced by an equally brutal figure but who doesn't have the charisma that Meles had. And the protests only continue to metastasize. Right? And as a result of that, the military regime itself decides, okay, we are under a lot of pressure, we need to initiate a process of reform. So that's how Abiy comes to power in the first place. He wasn't actually elected, it's not like the military actually stepped out of power. He was actually an internal candidate from within the military, who the military appointed and gave some space to open up the country as a result of these protests. One of the more recent ones that I think is really interesting is a group called the Lucha movement in Congo. They emerged around the attempt by the president to abandon his promise to step down in 2016. This is a really interesting movement because they emerged in the eastern part of the country. If you know anything about Congolese politics, that has been the epicenter of violence in that country. Congo is huge. Right? Congo is a country the size of Western Europe. And for much of the past 2.5 decades, the eastern part of the country has been the center of a major series of wars. And essentially you had a group of young people who kind of came together and said, look, we're done with these efforts to bring about revolution through violence, because over and over, it just descends into chaos, and we are the ones who suffer. So they created a movement called Lucha, which quickly spread around Congo, attached to the idea that the president had to leave office and allow the presidential elections to go forward. And they have been wildly successful. And even though they don't have a huge number of members, they have extraordinarily high familiarity and popularity ratings amongst the Congolese population. So there was a survey by something called the Congo Research Group, which found that after the Catholic Church, Lucha was the most popular political movement in the entire country. More popular than any opposition figure, more popular than any political party. 70% of the Congolese population approved of what Lucha was doing. And largely as a result of their efforts, the president was forced to step down from power to hold the elections. As I mentioned already, they were very corrupt and problematic elections, and so Lucha is struggling now to figure out what to do next. But it was largely because of their pressure that the elections were held in the first place at all. And again, this was despite the efforts by the presidential regime to crack down very violently on the Lucha movement. I was recently in Mississippi with some Lucha activists, including a woman named Rebecca, who was the youngest political prisoner on the continent. She was arrested at the age of 21. Fred Mauma is another leader of the Lucha movement. He was arrested, put in jail for 1.5 years, tortured. Luke Nkulula, another founder of the Lucha movement, was killed. Government set fire to his home. So Lucha continues, but they have really struggled to figure out how to respond to a very harsh crackdown from the Congolese government. This is the most perhaps recent successful movement that has emerged in the African context. It took on the name Just Fall, That's All. And actually, the picture here is from an earlier movement in 2012 called Grifna. Right? And Grifna was a movement that emerged mostly among students. It was inspired very much by protests unfolding in Egypt. Grifna just means we are fed up, which was a common motto amongst many of the North African protests at the time. These protests were really unable to trigger a broad popular uprising. They were mostly focused in Khartoum throughout 2012 to 2014. They drew in students, thousands of students would go out and protest on a weekly basis in Khartoum, but they never were able to spread outside of the Khartoum metropolitan areas. And then last year, in December 2018, there was a spike in bread prices in a remote town, actually, in northeastern Sudan, called Atbara. And that protest, which broke out in Atbara over bread prices, quickly spread across other parts of the country. Right? And actually, the protest first gained steam in the rural areas and in the small towns before it arrived in Khartoum. And there are these activists who had come out of the Grifna protests in 2012, 2014, who were able to mobilize this sort of spreading sentiment very quickly, so that the protests, by the time they arrived in Khartoum, become massive. Right? Literally hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets. The government cracks down on them over and over, but eventually is forced to bow to the pressure from the protesters. They arrest the president of Sudan, who had been in power since 1989. It's almost 30 years, one of the most brutal dictators in the world, somebody who was prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. But this is not satisfactory to the protesters, right? So you have these protests that emerge. Women were very centrally involved in these protests. They were truly popular. Ordinary people take to the streets in huge numbers. And then the military basically says, okay, fine, we'll arrest the president, now leave. And instead what they do is they actually, set up camps in front of the Department of Defense, in front of the military headquarters. And they say, no, we're not going to leave. Right? We've seen what happens in other parts of Africa, like Egypt, where the protesters think they have won, and the military just reasserts its power. And so they instead set up these camps. This is a really interesting example of what they were doing. So these are Darfuris. Most of you probably are familiar with the war in Darfur. And they sent caravans of people from other parts of the country, especially those parts of the country that have been most brutally repressed by the government. And they start these education camps in the protest site, where they try to educate other Sudanese about the kind of very harsh conditions that had prevailed in the more peripheral parts of the country, places like Darfur, Kordofan, Blue Nile, where the government was waging a very brutal counterinsurgency campaign against violent groups in those areas. Right? So one of the slogans of the movement then becomes, "We are all Darfur," as sort of the broader mass of the protest movement starts to identify with some of the most marginalized peoples in the entire country. The negotiation process is ongoing, but essentially as a result of the sustained pressure on the government, the Transition Council that is now leading this process of what a post-Bashir Sudan looks like has agreed to kind of be equally weighted between the military and the protesters. So the protesters are allowed to appoint a number of representatives to sit on this Transition Council. It's not a uniform victory, it really is. But it's a pretty extraordinary concession by the military, which initially was absolutely refusing to cede any power to the protesters and basically said, we will oversee the transition process, trust us. And essentially what the protesters were able to do is say, we don't trust you. And so now they are sitting at the table and will be a part of designing what will happen next. It's a really interesting protest, again, that I think some of you may have heard, a guy named Bobby Wine, who has been on the radio a lot recently in the US. He was on NPR, he's making the rounds. He actually, is an interesting figure, but this is a man named Kizza Besigye, and he's a kind of long-standing opposition figure in Uganda, which I've already mentioned, has been ruled by the military since 1986. Besigye was a leader of protests that broke out in 2011 ahead of the elections in that country. It's really interesting because the response of the Ugandan government to Besigye was the official opposition candidate. To Besigye's popularity was basically to say, okay, we're banning public rallies. Right? We're ban any sort of protest action. So what the opposition forces do in response is say, okay, fine, if we can't have public rallies, right? It's a political party. They're holding political rallies. It's a kind of basic function of how democracy is supposed to work. Even if you know that what the outcome is going to be, at the very least, you should be able to hold a political rally. But Museveni decides that they're banned. And so instead, Besigye, with a variety of different opposition groups, decides that they're going to meet every morning at the same location, and they're going to walk to work together, right? Because you can't ban people from walking to work. And these lead to these massive uprisings. So even people who don't support Besigye specifically agree with his kind of message that it's ridiculous that the government is trying to ban any sort of popular gatherings. Right? And so you have tens of thousands of people starting to march through the capital city of Kampala. Meanwhile, this is President Museveni, and he is campaigning in the rural areas. You can see this is a picture from the state-owned newspaper. Right? He's literally passing out envelopes of cash. Right?
How much cash?
Who knows? Right? He controls everything. He's been in power since '86. This is the context of the election campaign during this period. Protests are going in the streets of Kampala. Museveni then sends in the military. This is pretty extraordinary. I don't know if anybody's been to Kampala, but Kampala is a very cosmopolitan city. A lot of international organizations are based in Kampala because it's a very pleasant place to live. To see American manufactured Humvees rolling down the streets of Kampala with soldiers is a very extraordinary thing. Right? This is not how Kampala usually looks. But Museveni eventually sends in the military, cracks down on the protests, steals the election, and he's still in power today. Which then leads to the current protest movement that has emerged. This is a figure named Bobby Wine. Bobby Wine, as I mentioned, is currently in the US. He's a musician, he's a rapper. And he has come to the forefront amongst something called the People's Power. So there's an election coming up next year. Bobby Wine, he actually ran for parliament a few years ago, and he's an MP. And he's become a wildly popular figure. You may notice that he wears this red beret. This is a guy named Ziggy Wine. This is one of the musicians that is part of Bobby Wine's crew. Ziggy Wine was killed earlier this year. He was tortured by the government, killed in jail. And this has only sort of fueled the popularity of Bobby Wine. So Bobby Wine has become this sort of iconic figure. He's running, he's endorsing a number of candidates. His red beret is kind of the key symbol of the People Power movement in Uganda. Last month, Museveni actually designated this a banned piece of clothing because he said that it had a military purpose, and hence people should not wear the red beret in the streets. So now if you walk in Kampala with the red beret, you could be arrested. But it all tends to fuel the popularity of Bobby Wine. It's not clear if Bobby Wine is going to be able to win anything like an election, but his popularity only tends to increase. Most people assume that he will be arrested ahead of the election, and even if he's able to kind of hold on to power, he's not going to be actually allowed to win the presidential election in the country. All right, let me just wrap up with a couple kind of final thoughts here. One of the things that has been consistent since the colonial period is the way in which African governments have responded to popular protest movements. Rather than sort of respecting kind of the democratic right to free assembly and free speech, which is at the core of what a protest movement is, they have responded very brutally with military force. And so this is a colonial army going in to suppress protesters during the colonial period. This is Cairo earlier this year, where the Egyptian government continues to send the military out in the streets to break up protests. I keep showing images from many different countries. It's a very common pattern of how African governments have been responding to the upsurge in protests across the continent. The other way in which African governments have been dealing with the question of protest is by these discourses of development. So this is Ethiopia a few years ago, and so largely fueled by money that came from the West, the Ethiopian government started to shut down public spaces and privatize them. And the theory behind this, which was common in many different African countries after the Arab Spring, was that the problem was that you had too much public space. And so if you look at what happened in Egypt in 2011, all of these protests are literally taking place in Tahrir Square, which actually means Revolution Square. And so the response by governments is that we should privatize public spaces, and therefore protesters have nowhere to protest. And so Ethiopia was kind of at the forefront of this process. Ethiopia had, the dictatorship, as I mentioned, was very brutal, but was also very pro-development. Right? And so they got a lot of money from Western foundations, from the Chinese government, to do these developmental projects. And a lot of them were designed to protest-proof the cities, right? To create obstacles to popular uprisings from taking over public spaces through privatization and other schemes. And then the third kind of way that governments have really tried to stop protests is what social scientists refer to as infopolitics. The most crude form of this, which is very common, is just headlines from different newspapers in the past couple of years, is to shut down the internet. Right? But it's actually more sophisticated than just shutting down the internet. In many cases, African governments have been using the internet to identify protest leaders. And so if you look at the protests that broke out in 2013 in Sudan, they were initially organized through a Facebook group, and the Sudanese government just went and joined this Facebook group, and then based on the number of followers individuals in the Facebook group had, they were able to identify the leaders of the Facebook group and arrest them. So, African governments are able to use social media in ways that allow them to repress these popular movements. Okay. Just some trajectories here. I think as we see globally, it's very important for me to situate African countries within this broader context. And I think that this rise of illiberal democracy is something that we're all dealing with around the world. There's a growing disillusionment with the electoral model of democracy. There's been a rise of conservative African nationalism, and so in some countries you see very populist leaders coming to power, different than what we've seen in places like India or Brazil or the United States, who are touting a kind of conservative African nationalism. Economic, there is still this very strong push for foreign investment, despite the fact that this is not actually reducing poverty across the country. What's extraordinary here is that, that even when opposition parties come into power in African countries, they tend to continue the economic policies of their predecessors, and so there is no kind of economic alternatives that are being put forth. In other words, both politically and economically, the trends that I tried to identify here that have driven the protests all along are likely to continue, which means that the protests are likely to continue as well. And I think there, is a sort of reality of global challenges versus the difficulty of global solidarity. I think around the world, we're seeing this disillusionment with the form of government in many different countries simultaneously, and it's very challenging to figure out, what are the relationships between all these disparate locations. And I think, let me just end here with sort of, one attempt to kind of create connections between social movements in the African context, and the goal is to spread to the diaspora as well. So last year I was part of a delegation from the United States that attended was the first version of something called the University for the Education of Citizens, or the Popular University for the Education of Citizens, that was held in Dakar, that brought together 40 different African movements from 20 different African countries, where they have decided to create something called the African Network. This is very much inspired by the anti-colonial struggles of the 1940s and 1950s, where I began. As I mentioned, people like Prince Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, and many other African leaders of the time would gather in different sites and debate common strategies for how to transform Africa. And these social movements now are trying to recreate that by building movement-to-movement solidarity. Right? So essentially the model here is a movement of movements. Each of these movements represent different causes in different countries. They can feel very disconnected from each other, but they're often tackling a common set of issues. Right? So the idea here is that if they can have a network in place where they can kind of lend support to each other, share strategies and tactics, and kind of demonstrate solidarity with each other's struggles, they'll be more effective than if they are sort of laboring alone in each of their countries. Let me leave it there and open up to questions. Thank you so much.
Well, when it comes to this university, a lot of African countries do not have the freedom of voice, and as I mentioned with the use of the internet and finding leaders and members who are protesting, is there, within solidarity, is there also do they recognize people, or is it like a secret, like, if you do not want to be seen, or you don't want your country to know who you are you protected by the university or by
Yeah, no, good. It's a great question. So part of the reason it's called the Popular University for the Education of Citizens is that it's, a much more innocuous name than, movement stroke for government. And so this is intentional. And the reason that Dakar was selected is that Senegal is one of the more liberal countries in the African context. The NMR, as I mentioned, is a pretty well-established group there. The leader of the NMR actually was called in by the head of security in the country and had to basically say, look, we're not here fomenting revolution, we're here to kind of talk about strategies and youth engagement. Right? So there is a conscious effort to sort of downplay the intentions of some of these groups. But again, these groups are not necessarily calling for revolution's sake. Right? They are really citizens' movements. This is the intentional language that they use to say, look, we actually want to just improve the conditions of life for ordinary Africans. If that leads us to kind of go onto the streets, call for the government, that's where it takes us, but that's not the starting point. There's no romanticism around popular uprisings themselves for the sake of popular uprisings. That being said, I mean, I think there were real challenges. Right? So, for example, there was a representative there from Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea has been ruled by the same family for like 40 years. It's one of the most repressive places in the world. Right? It's also a very rich country. It's oil. But all that money is controlled by the ruling family. And so, their organization was called Locos por la Cultura, right? Like crazy for culture. They can't talk about politics. All they can do is have like activities for youth around arts and culture. And so they were attending this because they're trying to navigate the space. Right? They want to be engaged politically. They cannot say anything politically in that country because they'll be arrested and tortured. And so they're trying to use the arts and culture space as a way in which to introduce different types of ideas into the population. Right? But it's very challenging, and that's part of the value of having this kind of movement solidarity, because for him to travel to Dakar and to see these much bigger groups, it was really inspiring. Right? He kept on expressing his gratitude for the invitation, because he's existing in such a repressive environment, and he can feel very lonely. You can feel completely isolated when you don't have the space. And there was somebody else from, I want to say Togo. These were, again, very working class activists. This guy had never left his country before. And he had simply gone out in the street and complained about the mayor, and then he was arrested and put in jail for 2 years. And you can feel like nobody in the world is seeing that. That's not the kind of protest that is going to garner headlines in the West. It's only when these people have millions in the street and are overthrowing governments that they get any attention whatsoever. And so having this kind of grassroots-centric effort that is unfolding in the African context is targeted not towards sort of those prominent activists who kind of gain international exposure, but kind of the ordinary Africans who are protesting, is a really different model that the organizers of the Free Feed Network are trying to center. And we'll see. I don't think it's clear how this is going to end, but I think they're very determined and committed to this process. Yeah.
So just to piggyback on that, I mean, it also builds the next step to building trust, right? Like you have to make those private associations to trust, so like you have to find that out in space. And I think it's because the question, even when we talked about it in class the other day, we're talking about this really your work. It's almost like political development through protest, right? So it's like so to what end do you create the necessary trust base to move it to a non-protest kind of political voice? How do you make more of a participatory voice structure that's more within the legislative? How do you bring the street back in, kind of a thing? So we've struggled all along, as far as when the social trust is lost. And here you have the long history of no having any kind of a social trust. So I think that's kind of that's what Priscilla's point is you need to create that framework where people find an empowerment mechanism too. Right? So,
I think the question of trust is really important. Right? So the fundamental assumption of social movements is that you're not going to defeat the state by having more economic power than the state. You're not going to defeat the state by having more military power than the state. Right? That all you have is the trust of the population. That's the core of the concept of people's power. Right? Is the idea that that there are different forms of power, and that a social movement can kind of play on a different terrain. Right? So you're not trying to contest the power of the state by waging a war, right? Because you know how that's going to go. But instead, you're trying to gain power from a different source. And so that's a much longer and slower process in many ways. Right? But if you put in place these sort of structures and these sort of networks, then they can be activated fairly quickly. So you wait for the next crisis, because there will be a next crisis. Maybe there will be a spike in oil prices, or maybe there will be a stolen election. And that's the moment that you're waiting for, so you can activate the broader network. But it's very difficult. It's not like competing in an election. Right? It's not like launching a war or engaging in a terrorist attack. Even if your outcome, even if you're aiming for the same kind of outcome, which is to transform the government itself. Yes, please.
You mentioned one of the reasons that Africa's been left out of the conversation of protest because of the Western idea of protesting is obviously there's an issue, you protest it, and then it's met, and then you use the bread example in Sudan. Could you say race plays a part in it? Because for me personally, I know when I was learning about the Arab Spring, that was advertised as a protest, whereas like I'm from Sudan and like learning about Sudan, and that protest, it was not called a protest, it was just like you said, a bread problem, or like the fight of like the price on bread.
I mean, absolutely, right? I think that's part of the reason that we were in the book so adamant about including North Africa into an African narrative, right? Because that tendency to divorce North Africa from the rest of Africa is a racist one, right? It's not something that actually makes any historical or other sense. Sahara is not this sort of thick line in the wall. It's not like the wall that Trump wants to build between the US and Mexico. It is a terrain in which peoples have exchanged for millennia. The only reason we even imagine North Africa as different was a result of colonial era racist policies in Sudan, where they actually literally just drew a line and said, no people from north of here can go south, no people from south of here can go north. And that's, basically 20th century history. It's not an ancient history or anything like that. Before that, people always moved freely across these spaces. If you're from Sudan, you know how diverse the Sahara actually is. So yes, I think race is hugely important to how we continue to conceptualize Africa and why we assume that Africans don't engage in protests. It's no different than how we think about it in the United States. If you look at black people protesting, media will immediately refer to those as riots. And why? In Sudan, when the protests were breaking out, there was some violence that took place. That people were targeting gas stations. Because the gas station was a symbol of the regime's corruption. The regime controlled the oil industry and made their money by selling the gas back to the people who should have owned the oil industry. So they attacked the gas station. And in the media, they were like, riots break out in Sudan. But they were actually intentional protests. They weren't actually using violence against people, but were targeting symbols of the regime itself. But the way it was interpreted really fit into the narrative the regime itself wanted to center, which is that these are not legitimate protests, these are riots organized by criminal gangs. And the Western media, unfortunately, played into that until they couldn't put forth that narrative anymore. So you have to, I think, push back against those conceptions. And I think that tendency to try to divorce North Africa from the rest of the African continent, there is no historical or really justified reason why we should think of North Africa as distinct from the rest of the continent. Yes?
So, looking at these case studies of African protests, what can other countries take away from them in terms of what's going to be most successful in politics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, what I have seen is a number of things. Right? I think that a lot of these movements are really trying to learn from each other's experiences. I think that's the value of thinking of it in this sort of networked way. There's kind of a crude version of this in the social science literature that talks about protest contagion. I think that's kind of the wrong interpretive lens for understanding what's going on. That sort of assumes that, here I live in North America or in the United States, and a protest breaks out in Canada. I'm like, oh, yeah, those Canadians are protesting. I should go protest. That's the contagion model. And I think when the Arab Spring was unfolding, there was a lot of that kind of very generic analysis going on. And so people are like, well, why are people now protesting in Egypt? It's like, well, they saw what happened in Tunisia, so now they're protesting in Egypt. And that was a very ahistorical interpretation of what was happening. Actually, in Egypt, there were protests going back to 2008. And, they were substantive and meaningful. Of course, people are aware of what's happening in the region, but they're not suddenly, changing their political behavior because they see something happening in another country. What does happen, and I think this is actually the lesson I would suggest you can take from this, is that, many of these movements do learn across time and space. So what I was trying to get at, I brushed through all the cases here, but it's really interesting when, in the book, I wrote about the 2012-2014 protests in Sudan. And then by the end of 2014, those protests disappeared. Right? So most people, if they paid any attention to what was happening in Sudan, were basically like, oh, Sudan failed to have an Arab Spring of its own. Right? That was the narrative that became entrenched very quickly. It's like the Bashir regime has survived. Right? And then 4 years later, another set of protests broke out. People were like, oh, what's driving this protest? And it was like, there was no connection between the 2018 protests and the 2012-2014 protests. But actually, if you paid attention, you could see that many of the same activists who were involved in 2012 to 2014 were again active in the 2018 protests, right? Which is, of course it makes sense. Like, it's not like the protests get repressed and they're like, okay, well now everything's great. they had to learn. They had to understand what they were doing wrong. And so when I went to Khartoum in 2014, this was a recurring theme amongst the activists I spoke with. They were like, we tried for 2 years to get people out in the streets, and we failed. Right? And it's partly because we didn't know the conditions of the people who lived in the peripheral areas. We hadn't built relationships with them. They were mostly middle-class students who hadn't gone to visit kind of these shanty towns on the edges of Khartoum. And so they were spending time, right, going to visit these communities, going to talk to these communities about what's happening, so that when this other wave of protest starts to be, like kind of 2018, they have much deeper ties to these communities that then become the center of the protest movement itself. So that's a process of political learning, and that's how it usually works. I think our tendency as outsiders and observers of protest is to really sort of look and say, okay, here's a big protest. In 3 months, have they achieved what they want to achieve? Right? And if they don't, we're like, oh, they failed. And that's a very problematic way to think about it. If you did that with, say, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and you looked at the U.S. Civil Rights Movement in '63, you would have said it failed. And you look at it in '64, you're like, oh my God, it's amazing that you succeeded so quickly. And you would erase 20 years, if not longer, organizing that went to create that moment that leads to these tremendous breakthroughs in '64, '65. So I think you need to have that kind of longer historical scope and then a larger regional scope, and understand how actors, individuals, and that's kind of the project I'm working on now, is to try to trace individual experiences across these protest moments through individual life histories of individual actors. Because there you see, like, you may be a 20-year-old and you take the streets because people are upset about the cost of fuel. And then nothing comes of it. Right? Protest is repressed and you're forced back into your house. But how does that change your political consciousness? It's not like you can go back to how you were before. Right? You're activated in a certain way. It doesn't mean that you'll figure it all out. Right? So the next time something happens, you may have a better analysis about what you did wrong the first time and how sort of subsequent protests can improve. And so having that longer narrative, I think, is really important.
I think that's a very important point too, because it's how movements then become, going back to how movements become political parties in some way. So like if you don't have any kind of an outlet, so like a lot of those movements, even the movements that have developed in more advanced democracies, where you do have the ability of political parties to absorb them, right? You see that evolutionary process in a very Killian kind of a way. Whereas like in the process of the politics of protest, you just keep voicing through protest. So like the civil rights movement, once it reaches the goal, there's a platform appropriation on the part of the country for the Democrats to take some of it up. But if there's no party structure there to begin with, the movement continues to be out into the streets. So you can see that with the green movements, right, where the political parties that were able to absorb them, they were able to become part of the fabric of political articulation or interest articulation. Once they're not, they still stay out in the street, but they get really politicized. So like we were mentioning in class the other day, the fact that, I'm not necessarily opposed to having populist leaders, because populist leaders in some way create a political consciousness with a vast amount of like marginalized population that they bring into the body politic, right? So then they unleash them out to the street, and this is what we're seeing in some of these cases, right? So like, it will be interesting to see what happens as this movement's evolved forward, especially after this neoliberal kind of like attacks that are happening on all the societies, especially in Africa, where there seems to be like a development process. I was interested in the fact that you were using that we wave a language kind of a thing. If there is like a fourth wave in the future, because how do you tell me wave back if it's moving forward. Any further questions for our guests? Well, thank you very much. This was a very insightful and very, I think we all learned a lot from this discussion. As I said, this was our last discussion lecture of the semester. We have a celebration on Sunday. I invite all of you to bring a friend at the NDC campus. If you've never been there before, this is the time to find out where it is. If you've been there before, you know the way. So I'll see you all at 5 p.m. at NBC with some Mediterranean music and some taste of the Mediterranean. And as you can see, the Mediterranean connects us all, Africa, Europe, and Asia. So thank you very much. Now there's some cookies and coffee and